Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Solarplaza webinar, Facing the Challenges of a Booming Solar Portfolio. From wherever you are, thanks for joining us. My name is Stefano Kruku. I'm representing Solarplaza here as a moderator, and I'll be very happy to introduce our speakers, Chris and Edmee, in a few minutes. Short agenda for today. As you can see, I'll be providing a short introduction to the webinar, the topics. We will have the first speaker, Chris Frantz of Cypress Creek Renewables, providing insights into the very fast-growing solar portfolio he's dealing with. At the moment is more than 120 solar plants and a combined capacity of over 1 gigawatt. He'll be sharing with us the challenges of building the asset management team that is ready for such growth, the tools that play a role, the challenges that occur. And we'll shift into specific challenges related to data integrity and the large volumes of these data, the selection of tools and lessons learned around this. And Edmee, Kelsey, CEO of 3 Megawatt, will be providing these insights. There will be time for short questions in between these two short presentations and also after the two presentations. I'll come back in a second to how you can ask questions. We expect to end the webinar in about an hour. One step back very briefly for the people attending that are not familiar with Solarplaza. We're a company based in the Netherlands, but our business is very global. You can see our mission here. Established more than 12 years ago. So far, over 80 events in more than 25 countries, and we have a growing network of solar professionals worldwide. Few of the upcoming conferences and other events we're working on are on this screen. Event in Indonesia, the Solar Future in Nigeria, El Futuro Solar Argentina, and 2 of our 4 solar asset management conferences of this year that I'll dive deeper into in a minute. This webinar is one of the webinars we set up as a prequel to the conference we're working on these days. Will take place end of March, 28-29 in San Francisco, already the 4th edition of Solar Asset Management North America. And I'm happy, and it's great we can say it's the leading conference focused on the operational phase of solar plants and portfolios in the North American space. Over 500 attendees, 50 leading speakers, more than that actually, around 40 sponsors and exhibitors. We are actually providing 2 exclusive project visits the day after the conference to a rooftop and storage plant and a over 100 megawatt solar facility. Altogether we would say the must-attend event, fully dedicated to the challenges in the operational phase. This is just a print screen I took a couple of minutes ago. The speakers that are now accumulating on the conference website, you can get all the information there. A couple of our sponsors. This is also growing exactly in these weeks, still opportunities to join. And especially for you listening to this webinar and participating, there is a webinar discount code that we're providing. If you're considering or planning to attend the conference, I would say try to make sure you benefit of this. It's for the first 20 people that make use of this after the webinar today and tomorrow. It's an extra discount on top of the early bird at the moment. And you can see the link here and the code here. Some practical notes. Any technical issues, use the chat box on the right-hand side. Use the same chat box, please, to share the questions you have for our speakers, and my colleague will be sharing them with me. I'll be addressing them to Chris and or Edmee. The slides that are being used today will be available afterwards. My slides, but I think much more important, the slides of Chris and Edmee. So coming to the speakers of today, I want to start with introducing the VP of Asset Management at Cypress Creek Renewables. He will do a more elaborate introduction of the company himself. Basically, his focus on maximizing the performance, reliability, and of course profitability of Cypress Creek's operating solar assets. Over 1 gigawatt we saw now. In the past, Chris was also involved in the development of these assets or part of these. Second speaker, is Edmee Kelsey, CEO of 3 Megawatt. 3 Megawatt provides solar asset management software designed to support asset owners with the management of solar portfolio and all these risks related to this, and asset managers themselves with reducing their costs and higher efficiency. In the past, she was an asset manager herself, involved in project financing of more than 100 solar plants. Yeah, and responsible for the asset management of these assets, so she can address these topics from her own experience as well. Coming to the first speaker, Chris, we will be unmuting you now, and I hope you have your presentation ready for us, so you'll get the request to share your screen with us right now, and I would say the floor is yours.
I believe I'm showing my screen now, so if I'm not, please let me know.
It's excellent. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, and I'm excited to be here. So to begin, apologies for a little Cypress marketing, but you know, you have to do that. So these are just some key highlights. You know, we've been around since about 2014, and at the time, you know, maximum there changed since then. So we've raised about $2 billion, both to fund development work, so for capital to invest in building the 120 plus projects that we've got in the ground right now. It is about 1 gigawatt right now.
Chris, so sorry to interrupt you.
7 by the end of this year. And
can you hear me, Chris?
yes.
We're losing you every now and then.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, and there is a slight delay on the line. Did you move with respect to where you were sitting earlier? Change headset or anything? Because it seems to be the quality of the audio.
I didn't move, but I'm losing you now.
Okay. Well, please go ahead. Let's see if this works, and we will chat in the chat box if there's an alternative way to do this.
Okay. Apologies. I was just going over a few highlights about what we've raised and what we've accomplished over the last 2.5 years, and I think I was saying that by the end of the year we're hoping to be at about 1.7 gigs, and our goal is by 2020 to be around 5 gigawatts operating. So that's some Cypress highlights, and on the next slide, this is sort of how we do this, and I don't want to go through all of these, but obviously you all will have the slides. But we have become a fully integrated, vertically integrated shop. We do a lot of greenfield development, and most of the projects that we build and finance or operate are all greenfield development projects that came from our own development machine. And I think it's important to note that we sort of think of ourselves as an investment shop, and by that I mean that everything we develop and we build is based on what our investment team can do and the capital they can raise. So we're not developing projects that we don't think we can finance or that we haven't even locked the financing in already. So that really drives everything at Cypress. Is, in the U.S., obviously the investment tax credit is important. So what appetite do we think we have over the next year for tax equity investors? And that's what drives everything else. And then the last piece, and what we're mostly here to talk about today, is the operate aspect. And we do both in-house asset management and in-house O&M at Cypress. So that's just kind of a quick overview of who we are and how we've been doing this. And then this next slide is our growth rate, and it's obviously quite quick, as I think a lot of folks are becoming aware. And really, like I said, that investment side has been driving that. But last year was a big year for us, and we basically quadrupled the operational capacity that we have in the field, and also doubled our development pipeline. So that's sort of the Cypress story, and where we are today, and hopefully many great things to come in the future. So, and one thing I should mention here as well is that we do, because we do in-house EPC and development, we also do sell projects. So we, our goal as a company is to own and operate, and that drives everything. But I'd say we've been selling something around 30% of our pipeline, either through, ideally at commercial operation, but in some cases we'll sell a development asset as well. So that's Cypress, and then on to what we're actually here to talk about. So like Stefano said, I manage the asset management side of Cypress, and we definitely put a barrier between asset management and O&M. They are separate parts of the company. O&M is actually a separate LLC, and we do try to keep a healthy tension between the two. I mean, obviously it's a close working relationship, but they are thought of, or the O&M side is thought of as a service provider to asset management, just as it would if it was an external company, and it's really asset management's job to take care of that project, and to maximize its its profitability over the long term, and take care of compliance and really everything else that goes along with managing a solar asset. So that's kind of how we think about the difference between the two, and later when we do questions, I'm happy to answer questions about O&M and how we approach it, but give everybody the caveat that I'm not the director of O&M, so I may punt a question or two and try to get back to folks. And below here, where I talk about three-pronged approach, the next few slides will get into these in more detail, but this is just kind of a summary of how I think about asset management, as made up of compliance, the actual physical performance of the asset, and then the financial performance of the asset. And then these last three bullets are just some key challenges that I think asset management at any level faces when trying to meet that or meet that three-pronged approach. So jumping to the next slide, this is the three-point approach I was discussing, and compliance comes first, because without compliance, I've said to Edmee before, we've discussed this, without compliance you're dead. If you're not complying with regulatory requirements, if you're not meeting investor deliverables, then nothing else really matters, because you're in violation of your contracts, and you're in a lot of trouble. And so, for compliance, I think it's very important. It's been very important for me to have a robust asset management platform to work from, to track everything, and obviously we've chosen to use 3 megawatt and have been very happy with that decision. I know there are a lot of owner-operators out there that try to do this with an Outlook calendar and a spreadsheet, and I just haven't found that to be a scalable approach. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about scalability and how that has driven basically every decision that I've tried to make to build this asset management team at Cypress. And then, execution in terms of compliance. I mean, if any of you all that have been operating solar assets know, I mean, a lot of that is checking boxes, it's filing things on time. It's not rocket science. It's just a lot of different items that need to be managed and need to be tracked and can't be missed. So that, I'd say if you've got the tracking part down, then the execution side follows fairly easily afterwards. So the second bucket I split everything out into is technical performance, and I realize that financial performance and technical performance are very closely tied, but I do like to keep them separate in my head and the way I try to manage this division of Cypress. And the first piece is obviously how do you measure performance? And I assume lots of the folks on this webinar have been to conferences where people go into at length what the right metrics are, and it really all depends on your audience, and we use different metrics, somewhat different metrics when we are communicating solely with the O&M team, and then different metrics when we're communicating with either investors or maybe the rest of the executive management team, that their concerns or their needs are a little bit different. And so nailing that down, I found to be a little bit of a struggle at first, but once you get it in place, then you kind of are off to the races and can go forth from there and track those things and use those to manage the performance of your assets and also to manage your O&M team, and whether it's external or internal, and hold them accountable to specific targets. At Cypress we actually do put in place very specific targets that the O&M team is striving to hit. We tend to, or I like to make them a little bit on the aggressive side, thinking of more of those reach goals maybe, but so that's the measurement side, and using it to track the performance of your O&M team and to push them as much as you can while still being cost effective, and that leads into financial performance, which is largely on our end measured based on comparing what's actually happening to what was modeled originally. That closing financial model that the funding of the building of this asset was based on. At Cypress we, on a quarterly basis mostly, because most invoicing and whatnot is on a quarterly schedule, but we review performance of every single site and every single fund on a quarterly basis and compare that to the financial model, and of course minimize costs from where we can, and but also adjust expectations a little bit. And one of the benefits of being a vertically integrated company is there's a feedback loop aspect where we can look at some of these assumptions and say, okay, this assumption that was in the financial model maybe was slightly too aggressive, maybe aggressive enough. If you don't measure it, then there is no feedback and there is no opportunity to intelligently try to determine where you should be focusing your efforts when it comes to operating cost minimization. So that's really largely the way I think about asset management, and when I am trying to improve or build out the performance of Cypress's asset management division, I always think of everything in these three buckets. And on the next slide is really supposed to be all about what are the key challenges to achieving those three things. And one of the first things, and it I suppose should be obvious, and it wasn't necessarily as obvious to me as it should have been when I first took over asset management at Cypress, was how important the handoff process is. And that is true whether it's a internally developed and built project or an acquisition. Obviously, acquisitions present more of a challenge, when you've got a internally built project and a developed project. Then Cypress is in this wonderful situation where I can, swivel my chair and ask the, EPC PM project manager something about the site, or the legal lead on the deal, what exactly did you mean by this paragraph in this operating agreement, because it isn't quite clear. So that is very nice, but what was even more important was to put into place process so that there is a very structured handoff process at Cypress with specific deliverables that the the legal team that created or negotiated all the fund level documents, they actually hand off an abstract of all the obligations from those agreements. They hand that off to the asset management team. The finance team does something very similar with the purely financial obligations. Everything from debt schedules to bank accounts to who the appropriate points of contact are at the for the federal tax investor, for the debt provider, if there was a state investor involved, whatever, that's all in there. And then fee schedules, basically all that. They hand that off. And then there is a handoff with the EPC team that involves both asset management and the O&M team, where they obviously hand off warranties and equipment lists, and then so just do a deep dive, particular difficulties with that particular project. Could be difficulties with landowners, could be stormwater issues, whatever it is, so that knowledge is all passed into the asset management division and the O&M division. And then we can upload all that information into both our asset management software, 3 Megawatt, and then also the our O&M team works on a platform called ServiceMax that is built on top of Salesforce infrastructure, and that's how they do all their ticketing and track all the different equipment on site. So that handoff allows us to upload all that information. And we try to stick to that same process even when it comes to acquisitions. Now that anybody that's dealt with an acquisition, especially a COD act, knows that finding bodies are buried is your challenge, and it's tough. I don't know if I've got a secret to it, except that we know going into it that we're going to spend exponentially more time onboarding those projects than we would with an internal build, and we'll spend a lot of time on the phone with the party that we're buying the project from. So no secret there, except expect some heartache, some difficulty with those, and try to force them into the process that you've built, and not let people just simply say, oh, this is an acquisition, so we're just going to have to do this one by the seat of our pants, because that just doesn't work very well. So the other key challenge for me was, given Cypress's growth, was scalability. And it's very tempting, especially when maybe you've got 20 projects or 30 projects, to find easy short-term solutions to problems, and may save you time up front. And luckily for me, because I knew the trajectory of the company, I knew that that was just a terrible idea, and to always make decisions that that I could look back at and say, okay, this works for 5 gigawatts. This works for 500 projects or 500 solar farms. And so that's the structure I've tried to take into, to instill within asset management at Cypress. And a big part of that is investing in the systems and platforms that let you do that, like 3 megawatt, like a robust accounting software. We use Intact at Cypress at a corporate level, but also to manage the projects. And it's a very, very powerful software that gives us a lot of flexibility. And then we also have invested, it's certainly not proprietary software, but I'll talk about this a little bit on platform integration, but we actually take all the data from the different DAS systems that are at our respective sites, because as you grow through acquisition, you can't end up on the same DAS system as much as you'd like to. So we actually pull daily every single piece of data into our own Amazon database from all our operating systems, and have written our own code to run, to create dashboards and all those metrics I spoke about earlier that allow us to measure asset performance. So that's another way where we've invested in systems rather than going to every single DAS system and downloading the day's data into a spreadsheet and kind of using a brute force approach. And then the last piece there is a staffing plan that is scalable. And the way we are doing this at Cypress is, and the way I think about it is, I've got an asset manager and an accountant that are a team, they're a pair, and they manage, let's say, 50 projects. And they, especially that asset manager, is responsible for those projects. I always try to tell them, they own those projects, and those projects are like companies, so they're basically managing those companies together, and the asset manager is sort of the face of that. They do all the investor interaction with any third-party provider we have, like insurance, or in some cases in the past we did have external O&M. So that is their role, and then the accountant books all the transaction, keeps all the books, develops all the financial reports, schedules all the payments, etc. And there's obviously a support team around them, some experts in, for instance, property taxes, or more senior level accountants that review things. But using that plan, I can look ahead and I can say, okay, if Cypress is going to bring on another 700 megawatts this year, then I know pretty much exactly who I need to hire and when, and I can see how this scales through 2020 if we can link up our development projections with what we actually end up building. So that has allowed me to create a very scalable model, and it's worked out well so far. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, and I know this is a headache for many people, is platform integration. I know some folks that dream about one day there will be one platform that will be perfect for development, for EPC, and asset management and O&M, and I say good luck. I hope you're right, but it seems there isn't something like that yet, and that maybe if you're trying to be everything to everybody, it's not the best approach. And so I just try to ensure that all the different platforms that we're using can communicate with each other. You know, they have open APIs, and they've worked together in the past, so that I'm not the guinea pig when it comes to that. And that's sort of how we've handled the multiple platform issue, with a bit of the exception of the DAS systems, where, like I said, you know, the DAS systems we use have open APIs. We download the data daily, and you know, we create our own internal dashboards and metrics, and broadcast those out both internally and externally on a regular basis. So 7.0, that's all I had for now. I'd be happy to take any questions if you've got any, or pass it off to Edmee.
Thank you, Chris, for the interesting presentation. Let's take one or two short questions and short answers from your side now, and there are some other questions that we'll take at the end, towards the end of the webinar. One of them about the asset management organization within Cypress, your team. Can you say anything about how many assets are allocated per FTE within your teams, or how that is developing?
Sure. So I mean, it certainly depends on, well, it depends on a few things, but it's about 50 sites, 50 assets per team, and that's one asset manager and one project accountant. Now, like I said, there is a support staff around them, you know, and I think that, you know, there's a senior or two kind of senior level accountants and a tax specialist, and those are the main support staff, and they scale quite well from there. I don't see a whole lot of need to bolster that support group in the near term. So I guess you could say 50 sites for 2 FTEs plus the support staff around them. Now, the huge caveat in the U.S. to that is whether or not you're a NERC compliant facility. And so if you're, you know, I believe it's 75 megawatts or above, you have to be NERC compliant. And you know, we have a NERC compliance specialist at Cypress, and so he handles all that. So I guess the point I would make is I don't see a lot of difference between the amount of work on the asset management side that goes into a 50 megawatt site or a 5 megawatt site, but as soon as you hit that threshold in the US of 75, then you're in a whole different world where there is a much higher level of effort at that point to both operate the facility. You know, you need a NERC compliant operator and be a NERC compliant owner, and so we actually the operator of, we have one NERC compliant facility, and we've chosen to outsource that in the near term. So that's, you know, and that's largely a decision based on, in the future, how many more facilities that are going to be NERC compliant do you think are coming down the pipe, and is it worth building out a NERC compliant network operations center for you, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for elaborating as well on the question. Another short one. Have you found, Chris, that sometimes when you get into acquired assets, you don't have the performance measurement infrastructure needed to track the performance KPIs that you want? And if yes, how did you deal with that? Can you give an example?
A little bit. So, you know, sometimes, you know, I think, well, actually, folks on the phone may know that Cypress recently acquired FLS Energy, and so that is actually our first instance of acquiring sites that have been operational for quite a while. And for instance, for some of those older sites, it would, you know, we would have IE reports, but not the full-blown 8760 PV-SYST runs that were associated with those projects, which were key to tracking performance. And in that case, we actually just went back to the independent engineers and said, hey, you provided this report 5 years ago, we need the numbers behind it, and that was a fairly easy hurdle to get across. On the financial side, I mean, there's always a closing financial model, and if you're procuring an asset that's been operational, I guess personally I would try not to even consider a site that didn't have a model that I could look at. So we've always had those, and those are the two pieces of kind of tracking information that I like to have. So it's gone okay, but I understand where the question comes from. I could see that being a hurdle.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. We're going, well, there are more questions for you, which I will address to you later, so stay tuned. We will switch over to Edmee for now. So let's see if that works here. Exactly. And I'll make you presenter, Edmee, in the meantime, so we'll see your screen if all goes well. Let's see if this works out. Edmee, from an asset management software provider, I think you deal with a lot of the challenges, the daily challenges of asset managers, and you can also compare between the different types of let's say, owners and therefore related challenges, especially related to data. Can we test your audio? I would just say the floor is yours. So if you speak up, excellent.
Thanks,
go ahead.
Thanks, Stefano. Can you see my screen?
Yes, all well.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, really happy to be on this webinar, and also many thanks to Chris. We love working with Chris. I think that over the time we've been very impressed by how organized and smart his team is. They're doing many things the right way, and this is why I think he was an excellent speaker on this webinar. And so maybe one of the first things that I want to go into is, of course, Chris's team has been facing fast growth and also the acquisition or merger with another company, but there are other things that really make people focused on organizing their asset management. And so I think the question is, like, how do portfolio managers get into trouble? And so that typically happens, they do it the Band-Aid way, they're using Outlook, they're using Excel, everything is fine, and all of a sudden the management comes to them and say, hey, we're going to securitize this C&I portfolio, can you help me? Or, a portfolio is acquired of COD assets that, and Chris already alluded to it, where you really have to go on a sort of a scavenger hunt to find all the information that you need. A new owner or investor, as in the whole portfolio itself, moves over to somebody else, also is very traumatic often for the asset manager, because they've set up all their reports and all of a sudden the new owner wants to have it done completely different. Or they are using a new subcontractor. So we've spoken to companies that have said, let's pool our O&M companies. We have 20 O&M companies, let's concentrate them in maybe 5 regions, 5 O&Ms. And that actually means that when you're moving O&M companies, you have to make sure that you get all the documentation with you so that you have a complete life cycle overview of what the assets has been doing, all the tickets, all the events, all the warranty claims to be able to serve that asset correctly. Just spoke earlier to a person. They're just going through a major lawsuit. One of their subcontractors messed up. They're now having to look at their agreements and wondering whether they are doing this the right way. It's sort of a rude wake-up call, and I'm sure they're not going to be the last ones. New regulations also prove lots of stress. I know in Europe we had change in feed-in tariffs, but there could also be local or state rules that change that need the attention of the asset manager to do things in a different way. Raising a new fund is tough, because when you're an asset manager and all of a sudden you're pulled in constantly for due diligence, it takes you away from your core activity. And then if you're like a single state asset owner, and all of a sudden you have to move to a new state where they are doing things differently, they're net metering credits, or you have like other regulatory changes that you're not used to, that is also something that provides stress. So those are things that come from external. From the company itself, what gives a lot of stress, and I have to see how I can move to the next, yes, is as Chris said earlier, I think what they're doing really smart is they have a separate asset management team. They have actually gone further in putting it into a separate organization. And I think that's really the way to think about it, because asset management is process management, whereas development is project management. And you cannot combine the two, because project management always takes precedence over process management. It means that maybe you came in during your day and you needed to do your billing runs, and you get pulled in because there's a fire somewhere, and then all of a sudden your whole schedule is messed up. We see also problems when the responsibilities between the different asset managers are not clear. If maybe asset managers are in a pool serving different assets and it's not quite sure who's doing what. Or we've seen some organizations who structure the asset management by department and not by organization, and not like Chris said, that they have a combined asset management and accounting team, but maybe they have an accounting department. And so if something then is late or didn't get done, it's really hard to point the finger, which makes it sometimes difficult if you don't have the right responsibilities. Stress to the organization if a person leaves and takes a lot of knowledge with them, or if they're just absent for a longer period and somebody else has to fill in and they're not completely up to date what the current state of the projects are. We've seen a lot of people getting into trouble if it is not really clear what the asset manager and what their subcontractors are doing, particularly if the subcontractor thinks that the asset manager is doing it and vice versa, or if they're both doing it but they're doing it a different way, or none of them is doing it, which is the worst one, which we've seen too, where there was a case that an insurance didn't get renewed because the subcontractor thought the asset management was doing it and the other way around, and then the array or the site was actually uninsured. When contact people at a vendor change, that is also difficult, because if you don't have a clear documentation what has been agreed, then a new PPA counterparty comes in and says, oh, but I'm reading through the contract and I've been promised this and that. And then you can say, well, I've spoken to your predecessor and we've agreed that we would do it this way. And he will say, well, sorry, I don't have any documentation of that. So that can also lead to lots of problems. Another thing, and then Chris alluded to it earlier a little bit, is when you have to do a lot of manual copy and paste jobs, often there's an analyst that does that. That work is really boring. And so those people often leave. And also it doesn't really make good use often of their skills, and they can make mistakes. So it's a routine job, and if it's routine, there are better ways of doing it. I think one of the biggest challenges for asset managers is that there's always unexpected things happening. I was at an asset management conference, and somebody said, you know, when I go to work in the morning, I never know what my day is going to look like, and that's making it really hard to do things in an organized way. But you know, that's how it is. And I would say probably the most stressful thing for an asset manager is a new boss, because a new boss will probably want to change everything. They will come from somewhere else and have done something a different way, and that can be good, that can be bad. But what is sure, it is change, and change is stressful. On the workload itself, we found that the workload increases dramatically if the contracts and the documents are not in one place, if they live in different folders, subfolders, or different systems. People that are using spreadsheets, the spreadsheets are not synced. and or the same data lives in different systems and you don't know what the right data and the wrong data is. The gaps in the documentation often happens when you take over an existing asset and you're missing a whole bunch of data from its early the early stage in the life cycle, and you know, compliance falling between the cracks. I think that is something that a lot of people didn't think about. But if it happens, it can be costly. It can be costly to the asset management organization. It can be very costly to the investor. It is something that you have to structure well. You have to plan well. It takes a little bit of time to set it up, but once you've done it, I think there will be lots of benefits. I think one of the key challenges that asset managers have is to trust the data that's in their system. And why am I saying that? Is because if somebody puts in and says, oh, you know, I have a PPA rate of so much, and then you start invoicing on it, how can you be sure that it's the right PPA rate, particularly if that person that's put it in has already left the company? How can you know, what kind of tracking mechanism can you put in place to have data integrity? And I think that's something that in our experience, almost everybody is struggling with. In addition to that, the costs allocated for asset management are going down as as we all know, the project costs are going down, the hardware costs, there's a little bit more room to improve, so everybody's trying to squeeze everything that's soft cost. And so you have to do the same thing, but with much less money. And so an efficient way to get started is to make sure that you have all the data in one place. Chris's team, they've built a big data warehouse where they're putting all the data from the DAS systems in one location. But what we see is that sometimes that's not enough because there are also a lot of other data that are important to do any kind of business processes, like, you know, for invoicing you need the utility data that doesn't come out of the DAS. Maybe you want to validate your weather stations, and maybe you have an independent weather data stream. And so the more data you get into one place, the smarter decisions you can make, and the more you can automate your day-to-day business processes with tools. So I've described two business processes that are very primed for automation. I would say the creation of the invoices and the creation of reports, because they happen, you know, every month or every quarter. And so it is not necessarily just making sure that you do things in a sequential way, but also making sure that you have a what if in place, like what if a person is sick, who is going to do it? Or what if the data is wrong, what am I going to do? What if my invoice doesn't get approved? Do I have enough time to rerun it? And that's where tools can help, because they can track that everything is in place to get these things done in time. Stefano asked me about challenges of in implementing tools, and I think there are many. I think the biggest challenge for many people is that they are new to the industry and they don't know what they don't know. And so if they're looking at a tool today and they say, yeah, that kind of does what I think I need to do, it's not really about what was the Wayne Gretzky expression? You have to skate to where the puck is, meaning you have to look ahead and you have to say, where am I going to be as an organization in a year or 2 years' time, and what kind of tools do I need to have in place to help me with these challenges? I think the second thing that is important is that whatever tool you have that is flexible, because there are many different owners and operators of solar sites out there, and everybody has like different things that they care about, and often it depends on who the ultimate owner is. Like, have they collected a fund, or are they just a subcontractor? So they often have to report to different stakeholders in a different way. And that's why it's important that the tool is very flexible, meaning that it can help or be, on one hand, a tool that is catered to a very advanced user, where you have lots of little buttons to to turn your personal preferences and to customize your solution. And on the other hand, it has to be something that at the same time can be super simple. So if you have a new employee that comes in and they don't know much about asset management, the idea is that they shouldn't really have a very long-term training program, but that they can immediately slot in. So that's why we've created Bluepoint. Bluepoint is the largest asset management platform for the solar industry in the market today. We manage about 15 gigawatts in total renewable assets. About almost 9 of that is in solar all over the world. We have a large presence in the United States. We actually have an office in San Francisco. And so the needs of the owners are changing a lot, and the operators, and we actually adapt our platform very frequently to support all the new business processes that people come in or need to have to be able to run their portfolios. And we have a terrific set of customers that help us with that. We have, some of the largest asset managers in the U.S., very sophisticated people that help us to make sure that we always stay ahead of market trends and to support them. So with that, Stefano, I'd actually like to go back to you and see if there are any questions for me or for Chris.
Thank you, Edmee, and thanks for following up these insights. There are some questions here. I would like to start with a question to both you and Chris, actually. So let me read it up to you, and maybe you can first, follow up on this, Edmee, and then we can have Chris' thoughts on this. What would you say are the key aspects, skills, personalities of a successful asset manager within your asset management team, your scalable staffing plan? Can you mention, let's make it maximum 1 or 2. Edmee, what would you go for? And then I'll ask Chris as well.
All right, so asset management is about process. So you need to have somebody who is extremely diligent, extremely detail-oriented, a very reliable person that is also proactive in anticipating problems early to to be as responsive as possible to the needs of the project.
Great. Chris, what's your take on this? Do you probably agree, but can you come up with something else?
Sure, I absolutely agree, and that's the first thing I look for is somebody that's very detail-oriented, process-driven person. The second thing, though, is maybe you were alluding to this, Edmee, but somebody that's proactive. The last thing I want from an asset manager is somebody that comes to me and says, hey, I've got a unique problem, I don't know what to do. I want somebody that comes to me and says, okay, I ran into this unique problem, I dug into it, and I see these 3 options for a solution, and I think we should go with option 1. To me, that's a very different person than somebody that just gets stuck every time they see something new, because there's always something new. There's always a crazy landowner, or you're moving into a different market as a company, and things just don't work quite right or quite the way you're used to. So I want that second piece, where somebody that's willing to dig into a problem and find solutions on their own without just getting stuck.
Great. Yeah, so those 2 characteristics make a person already an interesting candidate for your team, I can imagine. Thank you. This is a question specific to you, Chris. Does asset management concern itself with responding to dispatch instructions from a local grid operator?
No, we leave that to the O&M team. We have a network operations center that is in communication with the utility, whether it's for curtailment or whatever other issue, and so they manage that side of things.
Clear. Okay. a question here. You explained how even if the O&M team is different LLC, they're both part of Cypress, of course, or under the umbrella. So an obvious question could be, how do you manage the conflict of interest between acting on one hand as the O&M as a company and the other hand as the asset manager for when there are operational issues related to contractor performance? Can you dive a bit into this?
Well, I guess I might flip it around a little bit and say that I think one of the great things is that we all have the exact same incentives. So the incentive of our O&M team and the asset management team is to maximize the long-term profitability of the asset. So our O&M team has no incentive to, mark things up, to charge more than than you'd expect. So I think it's actually in a better situation where we have our all our goals are perfectly aligned, and luckily I haven't run into a situation yet where I felt that our O&M team has dropped the ball, and maybe that it helps that we're in constant communication and very honest with each other and have a very strong working relationship. But I guess I haven't had to cross that issue quite yet.
Okay, well that's very good to hear, and I know your O&M colleagues will also be at the conference end of March. Actually, a question here, Chris, for you: would it be possible to see the organizational structure in a slide? We don't have it in this presentation, but is it something we can share afterwards with the audience? I can imagine it's insightful to have an overview of that.
Yeah, I think I've described it pretty well. I may stop short of providing a full-on org chart of the way we've set things up, because it flirts into that proprietary side of things. But if, I'm perfectly happy to answer more questions on it if folks have them.
Makes sense. Yeah, I understood you are trying to make it to the conference as well in 2 months. So if people want to dive into these topics, they should better ask in person, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Great. Yeah, a question here that I would like to first ask you, Chris, but also Edmee, want your thoughts on. How do you think of the trade-off between software and headcount for your asset management?
Is this going to me first, Stefano? Sorry, I missed
Yes,
that.
please. Yeah.
For me, and I think Cypress as a whole, we're very willing to invest in software if it's going to limit headcount in the future, because it doesn't just limit headcount; it also limits mistakes. It limits the number of people that I or anybody else has to manage. So that frees our time up to focus on other issues, maybe more important issues. So we put a heavy weight towards software solutions where they're available.
Here.
Yeah,
Edmee, what's your
I think it's hard to give metrics because it really depends on the assets and their complexity themselves. So I know some people are trying to do calculations and say, well, this is a trade-off, but I'm not sure that it's just looking, like Chris was saying, at how many people you need to manage the asset today. It's more like, what if that person leaves and you've been using Excel and you've been using Outlook and a new person comes? How long does it take for this person to be up to speed? If it takes 3 to 6 months, that's actually a lot of time that you're paying somebody for not doing much other than just getting up to speed. Whereas if you had like a life cycle solution in place, that person could immediately slot in. And so we all know the assets is 20-25 years. So think about, unless an asset management team says, great, we're going to stay for 20-25 years, you're going to have turnover of employees. that's just how it is. And if we look at our current clients, you know, some are experiencing actually quite a bit of turnover because everybody's looking for good asset managers, so they move around. And so to have that institutional knowledge within your company, there's also a huge benefit right there. So it's not just you know, the employees itself, but also the change of employees and the cost of onboarding a new employee that you'd have to put into that calculation.
Thank you, Edmee. Chris, another question here. At what scale, at what point did it make sense to internalize O&M? I can imagine it has been an interesting consideration. What can you say about that? How was it in your case?
I apologize, Stefano. I lost you while you were asking that question. Can you repeat, please?
Sure, of course. The question was, at what scale did it make sense to internalize O&M for Cypress? What can you say or not say about that?
You know, I think that it was always the plan, and it certainly, the scale also highly depends on geography. So, you know, for us, we started off very centralized in North Carolina, so it made sense, you know, to have our own field techs, our own O&M director, and, you know, I think Don and I spoke, you know, he thinks about things and, you know, one field tech per, I think, 20 megawatts, something like that, if it's, you know, in the same region. But I think long term, that was always the Cypress plan, and, you know, maybe even starting a little bit early, if you know you're scaling, is better, because then you can get all those systems in place before you have all these assets to take care of at the same time.
Makes sense. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Two last questions that we're taking. There are a couple more, but because of time, of course. Edmee, this one is for you. Someone is asking, is Bluepoint only used by asset owners, let's say the asset manager, or do you have O&M providers using this software too? What do you see?
Well, I think there is an interesting thing going on with what actually Chris was just describing, is that initially asset managers and O&M were completely separate, and then the larger IPPs decided for many different reasons that they want to do their own O&M. Sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's control, sometimes it's yeah, other reasons as well. And so we've been pulled into the O&M space, and we I don't want to say that we have a pure play O&M clients, but we're definitely people that combine asset management and O&M and need to have that integration between the two systems.
Okay, interesting trend to see indeed. Last question at this point is for you, Chris. It's an interesting one, so get your glass ball in front of you. Besides scaling up, obviously, how do you expect you will be doing things different from the asset management perspective once Cypress gets to 3 gigawatts, so triples the portfolio compared to now? If you just think out loud, what are things you expect will be you will be doing, or your team will be doing different at that point?
I apologize. Keep this question.
Okay, let me repeat it. Sorry for that, Chris. Once you touch the 3 gigawatts with your portfolio in the coming years, let's suppose that will happen. What do you expect, thinking out loud, your team will be doing different than it's doing right now?
Well, I think we'll have a NERC-compliant network operations center, so that'll be a huge task to build out. And I mean, that's just a reality that'll be coming. You know, I think we'll continue to invest heavily, like I've said, in software and platforms that enable us to grow, but I think that the essential structure that we've created scales to that level, and that's been my goal all along. So I actually don't see huge coming down the pipe and the headcount growth with the number of sites growing. So I could project the number of people in the asset management division, but I think that honestly will be the largest change. I'm sure we'll continue to learn how to work with our data and manage our data better and make and use that to make strategic decisions. But I actually don't see huge changes.
Okay, well, ready for the growth. I can summarize it. That's good to hear. As mentioned, we have to round off because of time for now. Chris, Edmee, thank you very much for joining us, and also all the attendees. Thank you for tuning in, for sharing your questions. If you have any specific questions for Chris or Edmee, I'll be happy to address these in the coming days. Feel free to contact me. You can see the details here. Again, mentioning the discount code, I'll skip that for now, but if you want to make use of that, go ahead. Last mention of our upcoming events, highlighting obviously solar asset management North America. We look very much forward to possibly seeing you there, and I think there's Edmee in any case, there's a fair chance you can meet Chris there as well. I wish you a great day or a great evening, depending on where you are, and look forward to meet you, our colleagues, soon in the future. Thank you very much.